and I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name is Samantha. I'm based here in Manila, Philippines right now, and I am not originally from the Philippines. I'm Singaporean, half Chinese, half Indian, and I have lived in Singapore, the UK, Sweden, and now here in the Philippines for a while. I'm back in Southeast Asia after 12 years in Europe. And what I do, I'm essentially a sustainability strategist, particularly in the areas of design. And we're holding this workshop as part of the Design Science Studio, as part of Regeneration Rising. And I'll let Heather introduce herself as well. Heather, please.
Hey everybody, I'm Heather. I'm in just 12 kilometers outside of Bogota in Colombia, but I was raised in the United States and I spent 17 years in England, and I've been in Colombia now for about 6 months. My background is a bit varied. I was teaching economics at universities in New York before I moved to England, and then in England I was working in education for sustainable development for universities and founded a transition town and a refugee asylum seeker organization, and the past couple of years been involved with Extinction Rebellion and Deep Adaptation Forum, which is where I'm drawing on lots of experience from. And yeah, that's me. I run workshops in these kinds of areas, and I'll tell you more about that at the end. And so I think we'll start the presentation. Yes. So I am hoping that you can kind of take on an attitude of just being completely open and curious about what might emerge from this session, and a sense of humility in the way that our own beliefs, we might be taking a lot of things for granted and be holding a lot of assumptions. And so that's what this is about questioning, which we'll talk about. And yeah, the next slide, please. So as you come into this space, I'd love for you to think about where do you find yourself the most in terms of, perhaps if you're a designer, like this could be a community where you do design work, creative design. If you find yourself, if you're in lots of different spaces, generally you could choose one maybe that you want to spend this workshop reflecting upon. So you're really thinking about one particular environment, one particular community, and then we ask you to ask yourself these particular questions that are going to come up and reflect as a way to hold on to maybe the dynamics of one particular community. Obviously, you can apply it to everything eventually, but yeah, for your breakout sessions and things, it might be helpful to have one particular community in mind.
Yeah, just to add on to that, so for example, for the community of the Design Science Studio, this is a very specific sort of localized, you can imagine it's a tangible thing. And also, people who are in it, and you can see the different dynamics that appear when certain people are in the space and certain people are not in the space, etc. Particularly so it's a creative community, meaning that it's generally speaking seeking to, create something, seeking to explore something, for example, and also at the same time seeking to question ourselves and question the way that we're thinking, like perspective that we're bringing to things, and what are we missing, for example, is a common question that comes up, particularly in the space of regeneration as well. which I have to note is a very global north space, i.e. there's a lot of white people in rich countries who are talking about regeneration globally, and they are actively seeking to sort of create work or narratives that I guess suit their context, but they're not aware that by pushing then that same narrative onto other cultures or communities, that's actually a form of recolonization in itself. So I think when we're thinking about what is my scene, there is very much a boundary to that space, which is what I'd like to highlight here. And so the first set of keywords that we want to look at in particular with regards to, so the questions that we want to highlight when looking with a decolonial lens is usually questions such as, what is missing? How do we see the absence for what it is, and to understand why there is an absence, essentially. So who is missing from the scene? And again, it's whatever scene that you're thinking about right now, and I'm simply using the Design Science Studio as an example here. What is missing from the scene as well? So not just who is missing, but what is missing, because sometimes even if you have the who, but maybe they're not bringing their what. And thirdly, what assumptions are we making? Are we aware that we are processing or embedding understandings of certain things with these assumptions? And how do we train ourselves to be comfortable to ask where that's coming from and how we're using those perspectives? So the first set of keywords that we look at in taking the Design Science Studio as an example, and again, please feel free to do this for your own community if you feel that that is more relevant. I think in general, a lot of communities tend to use these words to try to, I guess, bring this aspect of impact, this aspect of tangibility, that we can say, oh, we have this number of people, or we have started this number of projects, and we're impacting like thousands of people, or we're able to reach millions of people, or stuff like that. So I think one of the really common questions that I already spoke to a little bit is the fact that many ideas or concepts that are originating in the global north don't tend to be global at all. You know, they don't include China or India, or in many cases they include parts of Africa or Latin America, but again, don't call it global, right? So I think questioning these words in particular with regards to the community that you're thinking about, I think could be an interesting, an interesting starting point. And Heather, more about these keywords for yourself.
Yeah, I just, it's kind of this, going back to the word humility, and thinking, who is the we that we're talking about? When we say we are designing, and for what kind of society? Is it for every society in the world? Do we really mean global? And when we say things like co-create, is it kind of Westerners creating with other Westerners? Or is it something more based in the lived experiences of people all over the world? You know, are we thinking about refugees in camps in Greece? Are we thinking about people in war in Yemen? Are we thinking about the people most impacted by COVID, for example? You know, so when we talk about society and we talk about we, are we thinking of our particular privileged kind of life, and we're trying to create something to protect that? Or is it something much more radical, that it would actually be global, actually be we, and actually include all societies? So we're going to go into the first breakout room then. And I encourage you to introduce yourselves to each other and to, we'll give you about 5 minutes each to speak to each other. So we'll put up the timers and we'll send you a message to tell you when it's time to switch. And let me just check what it would look like.
And so for, just to repeat, those keywords are we, global, society, and co-create. And essentially the pattern for today is we're going to look at groups of keywords within each breakout room to be able to question them. So in the next breakout, we're going to look at other sets of keywords as well. So feel free to also explore other words that relate for you in your society, in your community around these keywords, like the we part, like who are we and who is missing and how are we viewing us, for example, and how we work together. So that's really the focus for this particular breakout room right now.
And I think because you're going to go into pairs, that it's fine to just make it a conversation and just kind of explore, find out where each other is in your scene and how these words speak to you in the context of where you are. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms. Yeah, we invite you to type into the chat anything that stood out for you. And at the end, we'll remind you that you might want to save the chat if you want to look back at people's reflections. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's a bit hard to explain, but I just noticed at the end where Mike came into our conversation, we kind of, me and him took over the conversation, and that is exactly what we're trying not to do. And Ada, you know, couldn't speak then, and we're more vocal, I think, and we had this correlation of working in East Africa, but then we're like the two white people that were like, and I was like, well, this is, so I'm sorry, but I feel like, you know, and hopefully we'll be able to, there's the uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah, and the humility to notice it and to speak it. I really appreciate it.
No problem. It was great. You know, I've learned a lot about what you do and some of the places that you mentioned in Africa, but I'm glad that, you know, we were able to to throw in some ideas. And I think during our conversation, the term good design stood out because of what MP does and what I advocate for, which is upcycle. And MP said she's into permaculture, and that's where we found the relation.
Great.
Fantastic. And so just to summarize what came out in the chat, I think if there were any other thoughts that doesn't have to be fully as well, it could just be a phrase or something that came up for you that was important, because the chat is what we'll take away. That's our souvenir for today. So do feel free to keep adding to it as you like. But Chris asked that question, do we have to establish what is we every time? And I think holding on to that is an important thing, because that will depend on the different contexts, and it will also depend on how much change is happening, right? Within ourselves, within the external environment, within the relationships that we have with the things that we have relationship with within the community that we are considering. So there's a boundary, but also there's influence in terms of all of those nested systems. And yes, Diane was the one who asked that question.
Let's make sure that you've got time for the next two breakouts and the next set of questions.
So just as a note, where all these keywords came from was when we were actually reading the invitation to Regeneration Rising. So all of these words have been used to sort of describe, or as a point of aspiration for this confluence of regenerative creators that is meant to be Regeneration Rising. And so we want to take this opportunity to look at how this shows up within the studio and also outside of the studio, of course, in our own context, in the community that you're holding in your mind right now as we're looking at these questions. So equitable, regenerative, futures, and just are all terms that are being used, I think, in even the sign up, like the registration place where you got tickets for Regeneration Rising. And this is an opportunity to look deeper into what those words mean and how we show up to try to build up towards that. Heather.
Yeah, so looking at the word futures, and it's plural, and it might be making some assumptions. The word futures might not include much about the past and what we have to learn from how we got to where we are now. Is justice subjective? What kind of equity are we looking at? For whom? And particularly at what cost? When we're creating or co-creating something, who wins and who loses? Are we dehumanizing anybody with our lithium car batteries? Are we doing a cost-benefit analysis that includes Indigenous people and their livelihoods? And as Sam has said at the beginning, like regenerative tends to be a concept that means something particular in a global north context. So the invitation here then is to go into breakout rooms again and reflect on these words.
The next set of keywords, just to use again the Design Science Studio as an example, is around this idea of creating social change, right? Through so-called creating a revolution. Sorry, there it goes. Or emergence, or these things about we're in a historical moment, or join us on this revolution. Like, so this sort of like flag waving, we're going on this thing, you need to come with us because we're doing social change. I think, again, a lot of communities, especially like impact movements or anything to do with particularly the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, this is a very common language that we sort of use. For example, the Paris Agreement being a historical moment, but in reality, what changed? And I think when we look at a lot of the way that this language is being used, it's sort of, you can almost imagine, or you can see a hierarchy or a pedestal that's being raised somewhere. And I think that is something that's worth noticing, that we're doing that, and why we're doing that then speaks to different perspectives. Heather.
Yeah, so who gets to decide that there's a movement or a revolution? Is it arrogant to want people to join our movement, our revolution? Does it maybe make more sense to join a movement that's happening already somewhere else. Just think about the lens and who's creating this and who's being left out. What does the word revolutionary even mean in the context? So yeah, Sam's gonna put you into breakout rooms and you'll have 15 minutes. So I just want to say that the reason I wanted to do this workshop with Sam comes out of my work that I've been doing exploring white supremacy culture patterns and cult dynamics. And once you start looking at these characteristics and patterns, you start to see them everywhere. And it's a bit alarming. What I would love for people to get out of working on white supremacy culture and cult dynamics is, how do we stop ourselves from recreating the same problems that got us into this? And how do we become better at spotting these patterns and dynamics? And how do we speak up and out about them? Because I'll say it here, because we don't want to inadvertently be eco-fascists. We don't want to inadvertently be doing the work for eco-fascists without realizing it. And that's a really strong word. And it's strong for a reason, because it really does mean sacrificing humans, you know, some humans, in order for other humans to be able to live, thrive. So if you're interested in exploring those things more in depth, I do offer workshops on ecofascism, cult dynamics, white supremacy culture patterns, among other things like language liberation. Did we just have a workshop in English? Might that be oppressive? So I invite you to go to the website, and I do have a cult dynamics workshop on April 3rd. And yes, so I just wanted to tie that all in together, how that fits in. So we didn't explicitly do a workshop like that today, but it was exploratory, hopefully making us more open, curious, and humble in the face of such huge topics that are happening now. And we're very vulnerable because of the way that we've been educated and trained in our cultures. We're really vulnerable to ecofascism, and it's being normalized. So that, and a reminder to save the chat and to keep questioning everything. And go ahead, Sam, you say the next bit.
Sure. And I think one part of this is the performative nature that, you know, that's what happens when we try to process things, right? We're trying to just keep saying the words to help ourselves to understand what those patterns are. But there's also another step, obviously, which is action. And how does that then bleed through into what you're doing? So that's the embodiment step, where there's intellectualization, and that's important in some ways, but even more important is embodiment. And how does that relate in the way that you show up, for example? So as a designer myself, I recognize that I am responsible and I am accountable for bringing in the margins. I'm not designing with my lens of the world or my way of looking or doing things, but rather I'm designing with people. So when we talk about co-creation, what does that mean? And noting that our experience is just one experience, that doesn't make it more or less valid. So let's always be asking these questions of ourselves. And that's how it'll actually help us to become more creative, by allowing ourselves to see ourselves fit within the context that we're designing for or that we exist within. That helps us to become more creative and allow more things to arrive. Or another word that is very typically used in social change movements, for example, emergence, whatever that means. But even more importantly, don't be a dick. Don't be eco-fascist and call out those patterns. It's all of our responsibility to tend to the garden, right? Another phrase that we use a lot in social change movements. Again, whose language are we using and why do we use that kind of language? But call them out when you see them and practice calling them out and sort of allow yourself to be called out as well, like with everything else. And finally, just to thank everyone for their time, energy, and all of the reflections in the chat. Something that I really want to honor is the fact that everybody who has stayed in this conversation are women. And something that I learned from Tyson Yunka Porter a couple days ago through a podcast was that most men have not passed on their genes. So of all peoples who have passed on their genes, a large majority of it have been women. So that tells you something about how women have always selected their mates and are sort of the keepers of our own human evolution. And I think we need to recognize that when we are women in this space, and our responsibility as well, consciously or unconsciously, and how that shows up in the way that we embody life.
Thank you all for spending some time with us and reflecting, and I'm looking forward to going through the chat and seeing what's been written, and I hope to see you all again somewhere. Go well, be bold, be brave.